This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.
Hello, I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's a special edition of Unholy because we're at that special time of the year between the New Year and Yom Kippur, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And so, as has become, I think we can call it a tradition. We've been up and running long enough that we always thought at this time of year it's nice to have something a little bit slower, a little bit more reflective to fit the kind of vibe of this period of the year. And so our guest is someone who really does fit that and speak to that mood really, really well.
I couldn't agree more, Jonathan. We are thrilled to speak to Nicole Krauss on Unholy today. Nicole Krauss is one of America's leading novelists. She's the author of 5 critically acclaimed books. Man Walks Into a Room, her first novel, which she wrote at the age of 25. The History of Love, one of my favorite novels, followed by Great House and Forest Dark. And a recent book is a collection of short stories titled To Be a Man. Her books have been translated into 37 languages, and she recently returned from a long summer vacation in Tel Aviv, Italy, and Beirut. We might talk about that a little later in our conversation. Nicole, it's such a unique pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you.
I want to kind of begin, Nicole, if I may, asking you about this collection of short stories. New York Times wrote about it. This, quote, Krauss's stories capture characters at moments in their lives when they're hungry for experience and open to possibility. And that openness extends to the stories themselves. And I add to that kind of tension that you're always preoccupied with between the desire for change and the desire for stability and the tension between power and vulnerability. I mean, you've, wrestled with these questions throughout your writing career. How different is it when you're writing it as a short story, when you're asking these questions in this kind of format?
A short story is kind of a little bit like, it's like a lover instead of a marriage, like you have there are different attributes that you're searching for. And when you don't have to live with this material or this character for years and years, the way that you do with a novel. So there are certain risks that I feel like I can take. Again, not even stylistically, because I think, or structurally, I think I do that in the novels as well, but just to spend time with something or someone or a concern that maybe has a certain edge to it that I might not want to live within a novel. And I do, I think it's always fascinating when you see your work paraded out before you, you begin to understand something about what there is that's kind of gotten under your skin. That you keep coming back to. And I think, you're absolutely right about this idea that somehow in these stories, there's this repeated theme of where do we find ourselves at any given moment in our lives on this spectrum that we're always traveling. We're traveling back and forth on it. We begin when we're infants and we continue to travel on it through middle age and old age of between a desire for stability, for the comfort of that which is secure, and also this other need we have for freedom, the freedom to change. I always think it's kind of interesting that we're the only species that is aware of the fact that it's our destiny to evolve. And that's an uncomfortable knowledge to have. We have to do something about it. And so I think these characters are struggling with where they find themselves on that spectrum. And it's something that I like to think about, however uncomfortable it may be.
Yeah. I want to pick up partly on the title, To Be a Man, and the fact that you write from the viewpoint of men as much as and as often as you do from the viewpoint of women, or and whether what that demands of you as a writer, whether it's freeing or whether it's something that is a response partly to how, the relations between the sexes are played out in the public life and public world, whether it's a kind of statement to be made. What's going on there?
I've been thinking about it a lot because I started as a younger, female writer gravitating towards male characters. I thought for a long time because I was arguing for a certain kind of seriousness, a certain kind of authority, which wouldn't have been naturally granted to a young female writer, even, 20 years ago. Things have changed a lot in that time. We all can remember that the phrase chicklet used to be used with abandon. When I was publishing my first novel and thinking about becoming a writer, and I so wanted to be taken seriously. And somehow there was this, I thought for a long time, there was an instinct to throw my voice into material that wasn't particularly feminine, because of course there's this concern that somehow the feminine would not be loud enough, would not be strong enough, would not be authoritative enough. Now that seems like a bunch of crap to me, having gone through life as a woman for as many years as I have. And actually now I think about that choice a little differently. I think that may have been, that insecurity may have been part of it. But honestly, I think there's also always been an enormous joy for me, as there probably is for any writer, in getting to reach oneself into the other, of becoming the other. It's so glorious a feeling that we don't ever get in life. I mean, it's part of why we're readers, right? Like we get to be inside and inhabit another character so fully. It's uncanny. They become us, we become them. And so I think having this opportunity to do that in voices and lives that I don't have access to in my own has been liberating and exciting. I will say that although I think I'm still drawn to writing in the voices of men. I alluded to this a moment ago, but in 48 years of life, a lot has happened to me as a woman. There's a lot of rich material to draw on, and I find myself attracted to mining that in a way that I might not have, simply because I didn't have it when I was 25 and starting out.
It's interesting. I would just sort of maybe go back in time to one of your most famous protagonists, which is Leo Gursky of The History of Love. And I remember reading it and thinking, it's not only writing as a man, but it's writing as a very old man. And you were a very young woman. This is a question that only an ignorant person that's never published a novel can ask, but how do you even tap into that, that dark loneliness of his character?
I think there must be something in writing that, in the way that I imagine there must be in acting, that is inexplicable and connecting to this outrageous right we think we have to do that. But this ability not even to question it, that to just believe somehow, that I guess I was 27 when I started to write that book, that somehow I could be him. Why couldn't I? Didn't I know plenty about loneliness? Didn't I have grandparents who had survived the war? Didn't I know something of these things, or couldn't I imagine them? Why would my imagination fall short? And now it seems to me a little bit insane. It seems ridiculous. I think I would have pause now if someone said to me, write somebody or something utterly and totally different from what you are. But I was doing the thing that we always do as writers, which I was drawing from what is me. So much so that when people would ask me this question at the time, where did this person come from? And I remember sometimes I would be asked in, New York reading where my grandfather still alive would be in the audience. And the question was like, is this man modeled after your grandfather? And there would be this guffaw from him because so far was Leo Gursky from who he was. And I would always answer and say, he's me. It really is. I dropped the bucket down into the well of whatever is in here, and out came that. And maybe I couldn't have written that had I not had the distance of pretending that I was writing an old man.
It's funny. Yonit knows I've written a bit of fiction myself, and the thrillers that I've written are from the vantage point of a woman. And I always did that because actually it was the easiest way for me to make it not me. Because I found if I had a male protagonist, it just sort of lurched back into being me. But I know exactly what you mean. There's also in everything and all the characters, there's obviously going to be fragments and parts of yourself.
But what you're talking about is interesting, because what you're saying really is that you don't want people to think that it's you. You don't want to think it's you. You want to have that distance that frees you from that assumption. And I think, whether you're on that side of it, whether you're like, I don't want anyone else to think this is actually me, or whether you're trying to sort of convince yourself of that, in the end, you have to play that game. You are always in some way or other writing about yourself. You have no choice but to write about yourself, because you are only ever you, with your experiences and your memories and your sense of smell and your sense of taste. And, it's like when a reader comes up to me and says, "Oh, I love how you describe that scene." And you actually look at the scene, or you remember the scene, and it's so skeletal what you described, like, an autumn night, a yellow window looked at from the outside, but that yellow window, that feeling of autumn, that particular light comes from the reader's imagination. She has supplied all of those things. You've just given her the opportunity. And I think we're always playing this game as writers and readers of like, who is who? How much of ourselves is here? How much are we hiding? How much are we showing? And that's part of what's so exciting about it.
The thing you were saying before about authority, though, that there was in some ways you were a young woman, and yet there was a greater sort of authority imagined in having the older man. I put a sort of Jewish layer on that, partly because you have a wonderful endorsement quote on your, I think more than one of your books, from Philip Roth, and in a way we think of him as the sort of archetypal Jewish American novelist, and already there's the sort of great American novel trope and all that, but there is a particular thing about the big American Jewish man, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, etc. And I'm just wondering to what extent that was also part of the thing, that you were, as a young writer starting out, there was this sort of there's a particular Jewish canon in American literature, and whether that was also partly where Leo was coming from in History of Love. It's
so hard to say. I know that, those who come before us, they create, first of all, we're always in conversation with them. I always think that writing is like being in conversation with your dead. Your particular dead, and everyone's dead, but your particular dead. And I think writing muscular sentences thick with wonderful vocabulary, I think of Saul Bellow. And so when I would find myself in one of those sentences, I would be in conversation with him in some way. Philip, I had the luck of being in conversation with in life for many, many years, although I was in conversation with him in my mind long before that, because my mother gave me Portnoy's Complaint when I was 12, and thus began a long.
That's pretty early for that book.
Yes, pretty early for that book indeed. But I have a lot of feelings about this idea of like those who came before us, because of course we like to pretend that we're not influenced. We like to pretend that we're sui generis and sort of sprung up out of nowhere, and that's a particular obsession in the world of literature. You think about music or painting, in which there's a kind of sampling or borrowing, or architecture, sampling or borrowing from the past. And in literature, we have this idea that that the writer somehow has to be a solitary genius, and it just is never the case. And so, of course, I wanted to sample from those people. History of Love is filled with samplings of Bruno Schulz or Bellow or Kafka, or, on and on, list went on and on. That book is very much a celebration of literature. Mm-hmm. But there is a point at which one wants to ask the question, or the question arises inescapably, like, what is there that I can do that is uniquely my own? What is mine and only mine? And if there isn't something like that, why am I writing? Aren't I required to somehow be? And I think, those early books are full of that conflict between both wanting to be in conversation with the past and wanting to clear open a space where I could comfortably live by myself,
So if we're on that conflict, and we are talking about Judaism, on the one hand, if you have a story in the collection, Zusha on the Roof, which is very much this sort of, older professor, a little bit maybe reminiscent of Leo Gursky, Professor Broadman, who, has been serving tradition his whole life and is trying to maybe free his own grandson, born while he was dying and then came back to life, from these shackles of tradition. And on the other hand, I remember you saying once that, very early in my writing life, you say, I realized it was a gift to have been born into Jewish culture and Jewish literature and Jewish thinking. So I guess my question is it more a gift or more a burden?
Can we say that the burden is a gift? because I think, there's a way in which being granted the chance to argue against the weight of, duty to one's history or one's people is a wonderful opportunity as a writer. It's not a great position to have to hold up in life, but as a writer, it's rich. And I think I'm still shocked that I became so engaged with Jewish thinking and history and text. I didn't expect that as a young person. I wasn't raised in a particularly religious home or a home that was really engaged with those texts. We were, Jewish in the way of, in a sort of cultural way and very strongly in a kind of historical way, in that my family had all come from Europe and in some way or other left because of the war and lost lots of family there. I think, I felt so strongly that I've not wanted to in any way be a representative of, 3,000 years of history. And yet at the same time, I've wanted to delve into it. And so I'm always occupying, again, both of those positions, both please don't pigeonhole me. Don't make me have to carry all of this. But at the same time, one wanting to have my cake and eat it too, because, there's so much to write about. There's so much to engage with there.
Just say more about the first part of that, the idea that it can be, quite a burden in life. Great for a writer because it's access to this amazingly rich debate and millennia-old conversation. It goes back to your thing before about being in dialogue with writers, and I think that's a very particularly Jewish thing. If you think about the Talmud, it's just each generation talking to the one before. But you said it was, in life, not so much kind of thing. I'm just interested in how that plays out for you. I mean, I can project your reader looking at the window. I can project all my own imaginings for that. But what was behind your saying of that?
Well, I mean, I think about being all of the ways in which being born into a family that experienced the Holocaust, for example, reverberates on and on and on and on in ways that continue to surprise me this far through my life. Or, the ways in which kinds of loss or are just embedded in my psyche. And that's difficult. That's not easy. I see it in reflected even in my children. No matter how hard I've tried to alter it, deflect it, somehow have it, Great House, for example, was written right after my children were born, 3 years apart, but it was written during that time. And that book is deeply about the kind of struggle with the question of what is it that we pass on to our children, that burden of inheritance. And then after that book was published, there was a review in Haaretz by a psychoanalyst. And I remember the title was something like Nicole Krauss staggers under the weight of the duty to Jewish history or something like that. And then Zuzi on the Roof came out of that, reading that review. So it was a long link chain of kind of thinking about this. And I say that it's difficult in life for the reasons I just described, but it's really a wondrous gift in writing because that story came out of that sense of conflict, right? And ultimately that story is for me a way of liberating myself from it. Here is this old man who is absolutely bent under the weight of having assigned himself the task of kind of carrying his father's desires for him as a Jewish scholar, a keeper of Jewish history. And here he is breaking free with this grandchild who's about to be circumcised and joined into this long, bound into this tapestry, which has caused him so much difficulty, right? Which has stymied him in so many ways. And there's this moment where the story ends up on a rooftop where it's like, what will happen? What can happen at that point, right? He somehow wants this grandchild, to be liberated in ways that he couldn't. And it was glorious to write that story in a way that it wouldn't be glorious to live it, right? It wouldn't be glorious to have had to be Brodman.
Yeah. We're talking about the tension in writing, and obviously there's a lot of your writing that takes place in New York and a lot of it that takes place in Tel Aviv throughout your career and in Israel in general. And it seems, again, as the Israeli in this conversation, that you kind of take your own unique path, because it's not, you don't gloss over our rough edges at all. It's not a romanticizing the Israeli, but it's not, on the other hand, the sort of even caricature of the aggressive, crude Israeli. And there's this a line by Amos Oz that said, Israel is a dream come true and as such is disappointing. And it seems to me that you're never really disappointed in Israel. You're just looking at it and observing it.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever approached it to be delighted or disappointed. I don't even remember ever approaching it, because my relationship with it is older than I have memory for, than I can remember. You know, I've been going there since I was an infant. And so it's always been a fact of being in my life. And I think what's, again, been interesting and maybe something of a gift for me in a way that, you know, when you're born in Israel and same when you're born in America, you have to deal with a lot of the problems with those places, right? You're sort of stuck with the problems. But as a writer and to some degree as a person, I've had this wonderful opportunity to have both. So I always have here and I always have this elsewhere. And, you know, those things switch when I'm in either place. And so when I'm, of course, in New York, Israel is this other place. And I can throw my mind, my imagination, my voice to it. And sometimes it allows me to look back on here with different eyes and vice versa. So, I mean, I think I mostly have American characters who are in Israel. I did write an extended Israeli character in Great House. So of those four narratives, there's an Israeli father. Actually, and I remember well that I gave it to, at the time, three really esteemed older Israeli writers that I was friends with, or that I gave the manuscript to. And I remember that two of them absolutely loved that character. And one of them, I felt, was offended at the notion that I would try to write an Israeli man somehow. And so there is always that question of what are we allowed to touch and not touch. I tend to try to gloss over that. But it's there, you know. I've been fascinated by having the opportunity to be in one place or another and to sort of occupy the zone between them as well.
Listeners right now are trying to guess who those three are,
right? Which
may relate to what I was going to ask you next, actually, because I don't want to gang up on Yonit, but you and I are the two diaspora Jews in this conversation. And
I have noticed that.
Yeah. The now late Aleph Bet Yoshua may have been one of your three. You're not going to tell us. But he obviously died this year. But I think you had a conversation with him. I did too, in sort of these public debates. And he had this position, which was really unusual in a way, this sort of classic, the sort of Coke classic of Zionist positions, which was the only full Jewish life could be in Israel and anything else was incomplete. And he said it to me, and I think he said it to you, you know.
Oh, yeah.
That this is what you're not the full pack there. Right. And tell us about that conversation and what your response to him, since we're saying about one can be in dialogue with the dead, what your response to him is. Like, you don't have to say was, because we're in constant dialogue.
I remember that conversation well because he was almost belligerent about it, and I found it so shocking. It seemed such a reductive position. You know, when you're a writer, you understand this. You understand the gift of subtlety, and it was not a very subtle argument. I think I've had this conversation with a lot of Israelis and a lot of Israeli writers, and one friend of mine said, yeah, but Nicole, 500 years from now, when the Jewish story is told about this time, it's going to be all about Israel. Like, and you're not there. So this is maybe a slightly kinder version of Puli's argument, but don't you feel that you sort of want to be there? But I think, like, in the larger picture, this moment to me is fascinating from a diasporic perspective, because for 2,000-3,000 years, you know, Israel has been moving back and forth between idea and reality. It's just swinging in this spectrum. When Abraham was told to go to this place, it was still just an idea. And when Moses was moving toward that place, it was still just an idea. And then it became a reality. And then it became an idea again in exile. And so for the longest time, I think in the diaspora, we had a right to that story as it was coming out of idea into like a true reality. And at this point, we are increasingly in America and Britain, we are increasingly on the outside of that story. We no longer have a right to tell that story from the inside. It's a story that's been hijacked by Israel itself, right? It's now happening not in a diasporic, Ashkenazi, religious, post-Holocaust context, but in a very Middle Eastern context that's secular, and all the culture that's being pumped out of Tel Aviv is, example to that. And I feel like that's interesting to me. That is a story in and of itself. And so it's interesting to me to be on the outside of that and look onto that. I don't feel that I'm missing something by not being inside of it. I feel like I have enough material beyond to write about. And in the end too, I think there's something reductive about reducing us to the places in which we live and the places in which we're born. I'm interested, for example, right now in writing about middle age. That's a country that has no borders. I don't want to be stuck in writing only about what it is to be middle-aged in Israel or middle-aged in New York or middle-aged in Japan.
I think there's a beautiful line in The Husband, which there are so many beautiful stories in this collection. I'd be hard pressed to say which is my favorite, but it's definitely one of my favorites in your collection. And there's this line about people whose roots are sown in two places so that it can never grow deeply in either. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you feel? I mean, being, again, your mother grew up in London, your father in Israel and in the United States. Is it a feeling that you kind of have?
I think, of course. I think I have a very sense of being an outsider or being on the edge of a lot of things. But again, that's a position that's incredibly advantageous as a writer, in that it allows you to slip under the border into things and then slip out again. Mm-hmm. I don't feel, maybe it's a certain rebellious quality of mine, but I don't want to belong to anything in particular or to anyone in particular. I feel it's so childish almost to say it, but I feel it in that almost childish sense, in that childish rebellious sense of I don't want to be anyone's. I don't want to be bound to have to tell it from one side or the other. I think that the freedom to, I guess I feel like when you belong to something, there's always the possibility of having to betray it. And I think you have to, when you write, you betray yourself, you betray what you betray other people. That's part of writing. And I don't want to feel badly about that in some sense. I want to feel free, because the other part of betraying is discovering something true that was, that nobody wanted to say.
I was wondering, because you talked about, being this young woman starting out in the literary world, and you found success at such an early age. And again, I wonder if that is kind of a gift and a burden, or both, what you would call the burden is the gift. But on the one hand, obviously kind of realizing pretty early on that you might be able to do what you love and, be able to make a livelihood out of it. But on the other hand, everyone kind of looking at you and having their expectations and projecting whatever they want on your career.
I both of those are absolutely true. I never forget that I'm incredibly lucky to be a writer. It's such an awful job, and it's such a wonderful job at the same time. When it's awful, nothing can be worse, because you're left alone with yourself, right? And out of some place that can feel sometimes like a bit of nothingness, you have to drag a whole world. And it's a terrible job to have to do. When it's working, it doesn't matter what's going on the rest of your life. It's such a beautiful place to be. It's that incredible feeling of being inside something, being born, something like a whole world, After all these years, mostly what I think about is that internal experience of being a writer. I've kind of lost sight as time has passed of what it looks like on the outside, what people may think of the books. All of that kind of gets shed with time. And now I think so much about this strangeness of, it's been now, I don't know how many, it's been 20 years that I've been publishing, more than 20 years that I've been publishing, but I've been writing since I was 15. I've been in this strange work, the most beautiful and the most awful, for so long. And I can't imagine my life without it. I can't imagine if I had to become something else, if this hadn't worked out. And it's so much just woven into who I am as a person, the choices I've made. And sometimes those choices, sometimes I don't know whether I've chosen things in my life because I'm a writer and I need to pursue those freedoms that I was describing. I need to pursue the capacity for change, or whether I'm a restless person and so have a lot to write about because my life keeps evolving and changing. But whatever the case, I can no longer tell the difference between the life I live as a writer and the writing, the life that I write about. It's been an incredible ride. I hope it continues, but it's been an incredible ride. And I don't know, the rest becomes very small by comparison.
It's one of those things where sort of being and doing sounds like they're sort of one and the same thing in terms of writing.
Yeah, it's just that my evolution as a person and my evolution as a writer are bound up with each other, and I can't imagine what it would be like if I couldn't. I'm looking at the books that I've written that are on the shelf there. I dare not take them down. I haven't reread any of them, but I know that inside of them is this now lengthening history of how I've lived and what I've thought and what I've struggled with and what I've wanted and what I've lost. And it's there, it's there, and I've been engaging with it for so long now. I can't imagine what I would have been like as a person had I not had the luck to have time for that, to be able to do that. I might have been a lighter person.
You haven't reread them? Is that what you said?
I haven't reread them.
Since you just gave the manuscript and that's it, and sort of never went back to reading?
Well, I sometimes have to read parts of them, but you tend to sort of choose certain parts to read, and then you read those parts and kind of forget about the rest of the book. So I have not read them, and I know it's a strange thing. I think they're waiting for me to reread one day, but part of the issue is that you need to change as a writer, right? And so you can't spend too much time looking behind you at what you did. With every book, it's like this demand for becoming something else, like reinventing the novel, reinventing what a novel means, reinventing yourself. So no sitting behind in the past.
Wow.
Can we just hear something about what the actual practical business of writing involved for you? Because you mentioned your teaching. Are you one of those writers who, whatever happens, rain or shine, part of the day you will write? Because almost it's just sort of a physical need that has to happen. And because I'm thinking about the difference in when you started and now, the ability to be in stillness and quiet, uninterrupted, it seems to me is much harder now in 2022 than when you were starting, just because of you people like us coming in via Zoom into your room there, and and social media and all the rest of it. Is it different now as a process from when you started?
I think so. Also, you didn't add the main factors, which is I have 16 and 13-year-old children, so it's been like 17 years since I was able to wake up and just write. So that changed things an awful lot. I still remember the days of writing my first and second novels and just being absolute captain of my own time and writing maniacally, and reading. Reading is such a big part of the work, right? Just having fresh sentences and structures in your mind. And that, for some years was my uninterrupted life. I will say though that I didn't put enough of an emphasis when I was that age and young on the importance of living itself in order to write well. Certainly I saw how important it was to be in conversation with the dead, as we said, and to read a lot. But so much life is required to write well. And that becomes evident as you get older and you've written a lot of your stories already, right? You've burned your material already, and new things must happen to you, or you at least need to observe them in your friends or your family in order for you to stumble into new things to write about. And so I feel I'm a bit less tyrannical about sitting at my desk than I used to be. I give myself more room to take an invitation, to travel, to live as much as I can. And then I don't have a choice because I have my kids. they drag me into life over and over again.
I seem to remember a conversation which you said that having small children is like feeling that your brain is tied to like a racehorse.
Yeah, like, I think it's like a team of wild horses. I think I said.
I was like, that's exactly what it feels like. But you mentioned travel, and we met Nicole in August when you were in Tel Aviv. I thought that was courageous enough for someone to come to Tel Aviv in August, but no, you continued to visit Beirut. Can I ask you a little bit about that
Sure.
whole kind of travel and how that felt? As an Israeli, obviously we're so close, but we can't enter. So I'm very curious about that.
Sure, yeah. I have wanted to go to Lebanon for many, many years, and Beirut has been this kind of city in my mind. The only other comparison I can think of is a place like Tehran. It's this almost forbidden place, right? Mm-hmm. Because as an American with lots of Israeli comings and goings, it's not easy to get there either. So I've always dreamed of it, and it's so close to Tel Aviv, and I've spent so much time in Tel Aviv, and there's always this kind of like discussion of Beirut somehow being similar in some ways to Tel Aviv, and trying to imagine what that's like. So it's been a dream, and I suddenly had an opportunity for various reasons to go there with someone who knew the place, who knows the place somewhat, and it was remarkable to me. As always, one of the things I'm left with is how the imaginary city that you live with all your life vanishes, right? You lose access to it the moment the real replaces it. And I want both. You want to keep both somehow, because that city you lived with that you long to go to becomes just as meaningful to you somehow. So my imagined Beirut is gone, but it's been replaced by this really rich and complex and difficult portrait of a city that was, that just struck me so much. I walking the streets there, first of all, it's nothing like Tel Aviv. I just want to say it didn't feel at all like Tel Aviv to me. And it's a larger city. It's a more, as if Tel Aviv isn't chaotic enough, but it's a much more chaotic city, and architecturally, just visually. But walking down the street there, what I found so strange was, there'd be a beautiful new, completely renovated building, and then the next building would be absolutely just a shell of itself. Mm-hmm. And you couldn't figure out what was the catastrophe that caused that. Was the catastrophe the Civil War? Was it this explosion of the port, which had a much larger effect than I imagined? Is it because of the economy? And so there's all this not knowing how this strange destruction came to be, because there's so many possibilities for what might have caused it. And then in the midst of that, this incredible life of these people in the city, and it was a strange and beautiful experience to be there.
Nicole Krauss, it's such a pleasure and an honor. And really, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We could continue talking to you for another 2 hours.
Oh.
Thank you. Nicole Krauss, just the person you would want to hear from in this time of the year, or any time. It actually made me want to go back to the books, the way she was speaking about them, the process, the thought, and the way she is deep in Jewish tradition and Jewish letters. Her point about talking with the dead, that line of Bashevis Singer, which actually is quoted in Shtisel, where the Shulam Shtisel says, every man is a cemetery. That you carry around with you all of your own losses and your own influences, dead and alive. I just thought that had an echo of that. And she is somebody, to me, right in that tradition, one of the great Jewish writers.
Yes, I could have listened to her for going on and talking about her writing for hours and hours. I think she's one of those writers, and I hope this is a compliment, because it's meant as one. It's a Jewish compliment. It sounds like it is, but you're not sure it is. But I mean that you're one of those writers where you could get a page of her writing and it's her. There's very distinct style of feeling this deep compassion with her characters that I'm not sure all writers or all modern writers are something that they do a lot. But
that is definitely a compliment, by the way. If you say to a writer that your work is identifiable immediately, every writer wants to believe that and hear that. So that is 100% a compliment. We should say that we will be back with a regular program at the usual time next week. If you love Unholy, and while you're in synagogue at Kol Nidre or Yom Kippur, you're looking for things to talk about with the person next to you, why not tell them about Unholy? Say this is the thing that is a huge improvement. Make it a resolution for the year ahead that if they want to be inscribed, they should become regular listeners. Maybe I'm over-promising here.
Just a little bit.
Maybe a little bit. I'm overdoing it, I know. But yeah, spread the word.
And we will say our thank yous to Gaia Glaser, Omer Primat, Rom Atik, and Yair Bashan. Have an easy fast, Jonathan. We always make sure that after the fast that we're okay, so we'll discuss later. But we shall talk soon, and we'll be back next week.
Fast well, be well.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.